Good afternoon, everybody. Sometime in early December here. It's in the afternoon. I'm in the bus. It's raining, and I have a few things to talk about. Go figure, right? Trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to tackle in this video, because I've coincidentally made two separate videos which dealt with similar subjects within them, and was having issues uploading both of them. I don't think it's really subject-related problem, but just it got me thinking, well, maybe it's just fate to give me a little bit more time to gather my thoughts and to decide exactly how I want to say things, because in the end, I really don't know. I don't know how to define what I'm thinking about. I don't know how to put it in a way where I don't come across as either ill-informed or mistaken by some, or to give you an example, some of the philosophies that I've come up with in my life, I've over time realized that they may not be as simple as I thought they were. Like, for example, when I was younger and I had a very strong socialist type attitude, I believed, and I still believe, in taking care of the weak and helping those who are less fortunate and improving our society. But after seeing how the system is abused, I started to ask myself, how do we get around that? Or I should say, you can never get away from the abuse of privilege in the system and money, but would we be better off with or without a government, for example? And it's a pretty bold question in itself. You can't really answer it simply. It goes into human tendencies to follow and to desire some sort of a leadership in their lives, which I don't think any of us would dispute. We have the family unit, even though nobody's in charge as far as the parents. Perhaps one parent's in charge, whoever wears the pants in the house, so to speak. It's not a bad thing. But regardless, even if the parents are exactly on the same page, they have power over the children because the parents are wiser than the children. And well, not always, but generally the idea is to share as much information as we can with our kids and to try to guide them in the right direction. And over time, through history, we've hired people to do just that for us, in government, for example. And I guess a philosophy of someone else, to give you an idea of where I'm coming from, is Ayn Rand, who wrote, and I think I mentioned this in a previous video, but she wrote that Atlas Shrugged, and it was a kind of a dystopian future where gas was $40 a gallon, and they were trying to rebuild the railways because it was the only way out, if you will, or the only way to transport goods affordably. But in the end, some of the smartest minds decided to pick up and kind of they started disappearing. I won't spoil it if you haven't seen it, because actually I watched the movie. It's on Netflix. It's a 3-part movie. But when I was watching that, I was thinking about the implications of having no government. And this is a libertarian viewpoint, if you will. And in the past, I've often, even in the last couple of years, I've said, you know, we can't, at this point, abolish what we have grown to depend on. It would be just like us, let's say, deciding we don't want to use the internet and we don't want to use technology anymore. That's not possible. It's ingrained in everything we do. And with government, we still need people who are at least somewhat competent to operate some of the, organizing to make sure people are cleaning out their sewers and cleaning out the city sewers and fixing any problems and blackouts and whatnot. So let's just, before I get too far off topic on that, what I want to say is that the libertarian viewpoint is that the people will take care of their own shit. And I've always thought, well, you know, it's kind of arrogant to assume that people are going to take care of things on their own, or that, you know, what tends to happen, at least what I believe would tend to happen, is, yeah, potholes would get filled in the cities that had enough money, and in those who didn't, they wouldn't get filled, kind of thing. But that's already happening, is my point. That if government that we have worked the way it was supposed to work, theoretically work, then it could actually be a very efficient unit. But that's a pipe dream. It's not likely to ever happen. The idea that many people with power and this many lobbyists over here, you know, there's actually, I think, 3 times more lobbyists than there are Congress members, you know, that lobby to Congress. I mean, these are, their whole life is based around passing laws that benefit the companies over the individuals. Now, this is kind of the premise I'm making, and I guess the discussion is, if you just let business run itself and run its course, and there's no interference whatsoever, many people believe that the companies would just get bigger and bigger and run everybody out of town. And this is true, but this already happens. On the contrary, it would also allow, for example, if I have an invention I want to invent and create and then sell, I have to go triple check to make sure there's no patents already pending or held by some patent troll waiting to sue somebody who's successful. Just the mere patent system and protecting other people's, you know, interests, it has a good intention at heart, but the outcome is that it stifles productivity. Because in a free market, a truly free market, if a company does get larger and larger and buy out its competitors, the people still vote with their dollars. And that company would have no say if another company decided, hey, I'm going to make the same thing and I'm going to sell it for half as much. Right now, you can't do that. There's all types of financial regulations that, you know, force certain types of industries and companies to, you know, only produce a certain amount, or the whole system's fucked. I don't know how else to say it. It's so, there's no government in the world that operates on that type of, like, truly, like, free market system. But, and that kind of tells us that naturally we have a tendency to try to hire people to do our work for us, and if not, then some dictator son of a bitch is going to come in there and take it for himself. And that's really the whole point. If there's a peaceful group of people who decide we want to operate without weapons, without a government, that's fine, they can do that. But in today's world, that land can be just as easily taken by force, by someone else. And so just like with the military, we're trapped into needing at least some form of military. And at the same way, we're trapped into needing a government. So I guess the big question is, how do we get around the problems that occur within government, you know, greed, corruption, you know, siphoning money off into private accounts? Is there any way to really combat that simply without actually disturbing government itself? We could get rid of a bunch of different, you know, entities within the government. Unnecessary, unproductive, complete waste of resources and time. Some of the studies they do and the research they do and the funds that they grant to companies that don't deserve them, tax breaks. In the long run, the very government that's supposed to protect the people's interests ends up protecting the corporate interests. It's so obvious, it's so well known, it is so ingrained in everything we hear that it's just like, oh yeah, well we know that. Yeah, the government takes your money and gives it to other people, that kind of thing. So I guess if I'm going to complain about the government taking my money and putting it into things I don't agree with, on the same token, I have to somewhat agree with Ayn Rand that nobody should tax a large company merely because they're making more money and then just give it to the poor and playing Robin Hood. And I haven't always felt that way. I consider myself a giving person to the extent that if I can and I have surplus and somebody needs, I would be glad to help. But we live in kind of a guilt-ridden society where it's kind of like we're obliged to help others. And her idea was that we have to help ourselves first. And I can agree with that. That's what I meant when I said people get mistaken. If I say, well, yeah, it's about being selfish and helping yourself first. Well, I totally believe that. But not in the way of selfishness for money's sake or for profit, but for taking care of yourself and your own interests, to know who you are. It's just the same as saying you have to love yourself before you can love others. And I firmly believe that too. It's really difficult for us to understand that we have to know ourselves pretty well before we can really analyze some of our viewpoints. But people like Ayn Rand, as well as like Friedrich Nietzsche, they were totally misunderstood. And so one of the most useful study tools I've found is to learn as much as I can about the most controversial figures in history, and especially philosophers, or anybody who did any type of study that became controversial obviously had something to say that people didn't want to hear. Because if the person said something so absurd that it was ludicrous, for example, they're usually ignored or considered crazy. The only time that people actually continue to discuss a historical figure with intensity or even hatred, it usually means that they made a point that gives people their own cognitive dissonance, that maybe they slightly agree with it but don't want to admit it. Not always, but often also the person who's misunderstood and misquoted, and those are the ones I want to understand, because it's a lonely path, you know, trying to learn about these things and to assimilate an idea of what would be a best form of government. Or, you know, a lot of people just say, oh, screw it, everything's going to fall apart. Hey, I agree with that. Eventually it will fall apart. But in the meantime, might as well utilize it and try to improve upon it. You know, it's the same way with an apocalypse coming down the road. Yeah, you know, why do anything at all? Well, I thought that like 20 years ago, and if I had just not done anything at all, then I'd still be waiting for it. So, anyhow, that's complex ideas are very hard to convey. They're very hard to convey adequately without getting either sidetracked or misunderstood. So anyhow, I had a different subject, but I'm going to put it in the next video, and I'll talk to you all later. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks for watching. Thanks to my subscribers. Thanks to my Patreon supporters. I really appreciate it, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. For what it's worth, it's pouring rain here and cold, but I'm cool with it. That's the Pacific Northwest for you.